Here in the studio is Stephen Sesh. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Yemen. He's also served at the U.S. Embassy in Damascus from 2004 to 2006. And joining us from London is Sajjad Jihad. He's an analyst and researcher focused on Iraq, and he's a fellow at the Iraqi Institute for Economic Reform in Baghdad. Welcome to both of you to the show.
Thank you, Anna.
Ambassador, let's start with Iraq. The U.S.-led war led to hundreds of thousands of people losing their lives in Iraq. 5,000 American soldiers lost their lives in Iraq. The war cost over $2 trillion. And yet, when we look at Iraq right now, it's in chaos. One of its biggest cities, Mosul, in the hands of Islamic State. In retrospect, what do you make of that decision to go to war?
I think in retrospect, given what we know and probably what we knew at the time, if we had thought carefully about it, it was a blunder of some substantial proportions. And I think that we're still suffering from the repercussions of that, both in terms of our prestige in the region and, as you note, our ability to focus more attentively on the problems at home and elsewhere in the world and stay away from these issues of democratization done incorrectly. There's a way to do this. There's a way that we can promote our principles and our way of life, but it doesn't really work very well when we're trying to impose those principles on another nation.
Did America learn a lesson there?
I trust we did. I think that the reaction to that moment in our history is pretty evident now, and I think that the pendulum has swung back towards a less interventionistic, if you will, America in the 21st century.
Sajjad, can we draw any other conclusion from the U.S. involvement in Iraq other than the fact that it was a total disaster?
Well, the way it was handled after the invasion, the nation-building project wasn't done to the right standard. It didn't seem to have a vision beyond 6 months. There was no real planning for what would happen to Iraq after the U.S. had won the battle on the military front. And unfortunately, we see this short-sightedness in U.S. foreign policy until today. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be all the lessons have been learned from the past. There is, as the ambassador is saying, there is a constant swing between soft power and hard power. 1 minute it's airstrikes and interventions, the next minute it's soft power and diplomacy. And I think the US needs to be a bit more consistent and learn the lessons from Afghanistan, from Libya, from Egypt, from Iraq, to be able to project its power in a more positive manner. Right,
Sajjad, you say things went wrong post-invasion. Do you believe the United States should have invaded in the first place?
I think if you were to ask most Americans, based on what they know now, then they would have said no. But for Iraqis, regime change was a positive thing, but perhaps not in the way that the Americans went about doing it. So perhaps it should have been left to the Iraqis to remove Saddam Hussein. Perhaps American involvement in the post-invasion process should have been more limited and empowering the Iraqis to get on with the job of building their country. But we do know there were plenty of mistakes made, and I think Ambassador Bramer has admitted that in his memoirs, and several of the previous administration officials have said we did not do a good job post-invasion.
Ambassador, if we look at the impact that this invasion, the war, had on the United States, ISIL was not around before 2003. It was a creation of this war. It's grown into a huge organization. It's now operating in other countries as well. It's in Libya as well. Was this a natural offshoot of a failure of American policy?
I don't know that it was a natural offshoot on that. I think that ISIL has grown organically from situations such as that existed in Syria, with a war that was prosecuted by Bashar al-Assad and his regime against a very legitimate opposition. He refused to give ground to the wishes of the Syrian people, and that created a vacuum in many ways that ISIL found as an opening to insert itself in that region. And I think that it's now grown very much and spread that virus, if you will, throughout the Levant, and that goes into Iraq, into Mosul, into those areas. And so this is something that we have to now confront as an international community and do it forcefully.
Right. Sajjad, how big a failure was it on the part of the United States when they failed to create the kind of relationship between Sunni Iraqis and Shia Iraqis in the immediate aftermath of that war? And as we've seen in the last few years, the Sunnis feel that they have been isolated. They've been rejected by the central government in Baghdad, which is a Shia-dominated government. It has, in many respects, led to the creation of a group like ISIL.
I mean, for sure, the Americans have responsibility because they were the dominant force up until 2011. Their responsibility was to try to improve social cohesion. Sectarianism was in Iraq before the Americans invaded. It was there during the time of Saddam Hussein and even earlier than that. So it isn't something new, but of course, the way the nation-building project went on from 2003 didn't really help with building social ties between communities. I mean, the decision to disband the army, de-Baathification in the manner it was done wasn't useful, wasn't conducive to good internal relations. And the Americans were basing their ability to build Iraq on the presence of troops. And then later on, they developed the plan to build up Sunni militias, Sons of Iraq project, throwing money at these groups to stop fighting the Americans and instead go and fight Al-Qaeda. And this isn't really a long-term solution because the communities were still divided. Putting up huge concrete barriers and walls to section up communities might stop the car bombings for a period, but it doesn't heal those communities. But at the end of the day, it can't all be the United States' responsibility. Some of the US-sponsored parties inside Iraq and politicians have to take that responsibility on themselves. They haven't helped with their bickering and failure to lead properly in terms of combining various ailments of Iraqi society and treating that all as a problem for all of Iraq. It isn't just the problem of one community to deal with. So the responsibility is shared between Iraqi politicians and the American administration that was in Iraq.
Right, Ambassador, as I said, ISIL, the militant group, has established a presence now in Libya, a very dangerous, significant presence in Libya. If we look at the Bush-led wars, if I could put it that way, against Afghanistan, in Iraq, the Libyan intervention by the United States was very much the making of President Obama. That was his war of choice. Would ISIL still be present in Libya? Would it still be a threat to Libya and the region and the United States as well if Muammar Gaddafi was still in power?
Well, it's hard to say what would happen. I do think that the president has acknowledged that the intervention that the United States participated in, along with its NATO allies in Libya, didn't carry itself out as fully as we should have done at that time. And I think we left a vacuum in Libya as well. And I think that's what we've seen now. We have two opposing competitive parties claiming to be the legitimate government in Libya. We don't have a real authority there that we can turn to. And I think the result is that a group like ISIL can find very fertile ground in which to take root. And this kind of a lawless state that we've seen now emerging in Libya is very worrisome because it does reflect, to a certain extent, what we're seeing elsewhere with ISIL and where they can kind of move in and take root in areas where there is no central authority, where there is no effort being made to bring the benefits of reform to the populations.
Sajjad, what happened in Libya was started actually, in what became known as the Arab Spring. The United States was a strong supporter of those moves for change in the Arab world. But when we look at it now, let's look at three Arab Spring countries: Syria, Yemen, Libya. The U.S. has closed its embassies in those countries. Was U.S. support, and it seemed at one point unconditional support, for the Arab Spring a bit of a mistake?
Well, I'll have to disagree with you on U.S. support for the Arab Spring. They were caught off guard. They were not initial supporters of the Arab Spring. They were unwilling to see Mubarak go. And only later on, very late in the game, did President Obama express support for the uprising against Mubarak. So I would hesitate to say that the U.S. has always supported the Arab Spring. In Bahrain, for example, protesters since 2011 have been out there in force trying to get better democracy in Bahrain. The U.S. has not supported their demands and indeed kept quiet when the Saudis rolled in with their tanks into Bahrain to quell the uprising there. So the U.S. has not been a fervent supporter of the Arab Spring. It has sought to, at various points, to take advantage of it, and when forced to by the international community, for example, Libya, to intervene to prevent mass killings of civilians. But the lessons haven't been learned. Once you've removed a dictator, what happens? Once you remove a strong man from a country, what happens? What is the plan? And unfortunately, America didn't have a plan. And the same goes for Yemen. The American role was limited to drone strikes and CIA programs there, but no idea of how to rebuild Yemen once you got rid of Al-Qaeda or once you got rid of the dictatorial president, you put somebody new in. What is the plan? How do you ensure the country remains stable? And what we see today in Yemen and Libya is the failure to plan post-change. So I would say that the U.S. hasn't always thought through its actions with regards to the Arab Spring and has been selective about which countries it decides to support in the Arab Spring.
If I may, and I would just point out one thing. I was worried when I hear a discussion of the Arab Spring as if it was one monolithic moment in the Middle East. I think there are a number of different and very unique situations. Yes. And Bahrain is one, Yemen is one, Syria, Libya. They're very sui generis in many respects. We can't have a template that says the United States should come in here into one country and find a solution that we can generally spread around the region. It's impossible. So we have had to try to find unique solutions to unique circumstances, and that has not always worked. And I think in some ways we've had to withdraw a little bit and see what the populations themselves want to live with, what they want to try to shape as their own future, and not dictate, again, what that's going to look like from our perspective.
Bob Burnett, who was one of the founding executives of Cisco Systems and has become quite a well-known commentator on international affairs, he said the U.S. occupation ambassador of Iraq and Afghanistan shows that the U.S. is good at regime change, but not effective at creating stable civil society afterwards. Where does the U.S. go to from now?
I think it's very difficult for any nation to go into another country and create a system from the ground up. This has to be an organic process led by the populations themselves. And I think in both cases, in Afghanistan, with the history they have had of failing to be able to bridge the tribal divides, the very difficult warlord situations in Afghanistan, that's enormous hurdles. And we go in with a very different perspective from our own Western experience, and it's difficult to translate that very effectively to the Middle East, to Western Asia, to countries and societies with very different histories and very different perspectives on how democracy is going to look. I think we need a very light touch in these countries. We need, I think as Shahjad said is right, we need to let the populations themselves be able to insert themselves more quickly in these processes and determine what institutions they will build, what they'll look like, and how they'll serve themselves better than we can decide that.
Right, Sajjad, so it's time for the United States to get out of the business of nation building.
I think so. I think when you have someone like Francis Fukuyama saying that the way the U.S. has gone about nation building has been a total failure in the Bush administration, somebody who very much supported the project of nation building, saying that actually lots of mistakes were made and perhaps it's not best to go about it in that way, in the formal interventionist way, then I think the U.S. would be wiser to empower local actors, to focus more on soft power, to get the international community on its side when it does decide to support change in a country, and not to go it alone, as we've seen in several countries, because then the anger of the communities that are disenfranchised becomes focused solely on the Americans. And I think that's a bit unfair. The Americans have had a positive effect in many countries that unfortunately has been ignored. But we do need to realize that some of these states have sovereign rights, and even when there is disturbances and changes, unless there is a critical threat to civilians, then unfortunately those countries need to be left alone to make change happen by themselves. And the US should only practice soft power, soft intervention.
Okay, so that's where we're going to have to leave it. Sajjad Jihad in London, Stephen Sesh, Ambassador, thank you for joining us here in Washington. We are going to take a short break right now. When we come back, we will be joined by two leading experts on the Middle East. What do they think? Has US foreign policy in the Middle East failed? Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.